Hello, Michael.
How are you?
Hello, everyone.
And do we have an order for the speakers? Is the same as in the printed program?
So, from my schedule, Mr. Kwolek, please start, if I have pronounced that correctly. If not, please forgive me.
Thank you. Hold on. Let me just pull up my screen.
Sure.
Let me know if you can see that.
Perfect.
Great. Well, firstly, thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk at these. And well, I've changed slightly the title of my talk, but it's Saving the Night from the Wrong LED Lights. Quick sort of intro. Some of you probably know Create Streets. We're a London-based social enterprise. We do a lot of research, advocacy, and work with private clients and the public sector. And we do a lot, as I said, we do a lot of research. Hopefully some of you would have read some of these publications. But moving on to this talk, conscious that we don't have a whole lot of time. One of my personal research projects and a major pet peeve of mine are LED streetlights. They're probably something which bothers many of you as well, because they're kind of unmissable. They're kind of spreading across our cities and our countryside, and they have been for the past decade and more. And personally, I first became aware of LED lights when I was living in Switzerland, and my street was converted from sodium lights, which was the standard technology back in the day, to LED lights. And suddenly this blinding light started piercing through my window blinds. And it's not just that it was a sort of very harsh, direct light, but it had an eerie quality and a color, which was a real red flag for me. And I also noticed when I go out on walks in the evening that the flowers underneath the street lights would stay open late into the night, and I'd hear bird song even late into the night. Thankfully, there in Switzerland, they turn off street lights around midnight, so it wasn't a disaster, and we soon moved from that area anyway. So I was kind of spared that. But it hit me again when I visited London in 2016, and I'd always loved walking around London at night. But suddenly I noticed that these LED lights and the awful light that they were giving was everywhere, and it really bothered me, because walking around London, it used to kind of transport you back in time. You could, walking the Victorian streets to Georgian streets with the sort of soft, warm glow that sodium lights gave. It really kind of did feel like you could be back in time. And now suddenly these same streets felt like you were walking through a prison yard. So as far as I was concerned, LED lights had stolen my night, and I, talking to other people, it seemed like other people had the same problem. And before I get into a bit more about the problems of LED lights, I suppose it begs the question, why are local authorities installing them? I mean, the bottom line is it's to save money. They are more energy efficient, depending on how it's measured. They're kind of 40 to 70% more energy efficient than sodium lights. And that means huge electricity cost savings for cities. For big cities like London and New York, it's quite literally millions of dollars per year that they can save. And it also helps them meet their climate change and CO2 targets, which they'll see as quite paramount nowadays. They also have longer life, about 5 times longer than sodium lights, so that means much lower maintenance costs long term. And not as important, but many authorities will also tout that the wider, brighter lights are good for visibility and safety. Some of them will even say that it's good for CCTV cameras. This last point's a bit debatable, because it's not actually true. There's no data showing that they are actually safer. There is sort of an argument to be made for perceived safety. So the basics, I mean, what really is wrong with them? It boils down to color temperature. Color temperature is measured in kelvins, and basically the higher the Kelvin measurement, the cooler the light is. And most of the LED streetlights which have been installed are on the cooler spectrum. In fact, the earlier generation were 6,000 Kelvin, and the worst part is that many of those lights are still up, whereas sodium lights were about 2,200 Kelvin. So, as you can see on these diagrams, hugely more warm than the earlier generation LED streetlights. And even nowadays, the standard, I'm not sure what it is in the US, but in the UK, 4,000 Kelvin is still the standard. So this is a spectrometer comparison of different types of lights, and it really makes obvious what's wrong with LEDs. You can see how they compare, especially the cooler LED lights with other technologies. Sodium is down there in the bottom right. You can see just how much warmer the spectrum is compared to how much blue you have in the spectrum of a cool blue LED light. And something which has always struck me is how similar candlelight is actually to the incandescent bulbs, which we used to use, and indeed the sodium lights as well. And in other words, incandescent lights and sodium lights were actually quite similar to fire. For the entirety of human history, we always relied on fire as our main light source after dark. And suddenly now we're experimenting with technologies which actually don't resemble fire at all. And it's proven to be a real problem, because that's why the light feels so foreign, so alien to us. And now I'll give a couple of examples of how local councils have been presenting these street lighting upgrades, as they call them. They really go to great lengths to convince us that they're an upgrade, they're an improvement. But I think the before and after images speak for themselves. You can see the before images, which they present as something negative, actually were quite warm and cozy, and now they're replaced by this really alien prison yard aesthetic with the cool lights. Couple other examples here. Something that really annoys me is that many of these councils, they kind of they ask you to wait sort of 8 weeks, some of them, to make a complaint. I'm sure that they're mainly kind of waiting for people to lose interest or kind of get used to them. But in fact, you never get used to it. They're always a problem, and I really don't like the sort of belittling attitude and the sort of we know better attitude that the councils show to the issue. I really like this. It's a satellite image of Milan showing the how much brighter and wider the city center is once they converted them into LED streetlights compared to the suburbs, which still have the old sodium lights. It also kind of puts to question the claim that many LED people say that LED lights reduce light pollution. Well, it's in fact not true, because bluer light bounces back into the atmosphere much more than the warm light. So it's really a false claim. And it's quite telling when residents are asked.
Mr. Kolek, could you wrap it up in the next couple of minutes?
Okay, yeah, sorry. I guess I'll try to flip through this, but yeah, I mean, essentially people have been complaining. People complain about not being able to sleep and just how much worse the lights are. When Boulder, Colorado did a questionnaire of residents, they found that 84% preferred warmer lights. It's really not just an aesthetic concern. A lot of experts have been warning for a decade or more about just how problematic it is. The American Medical Association warned in 2016 what a problem they were. Public Health England has also warned about the dangers of LED lights. And as I said, even if the aesthetics don't bother you, there is this huge environmental problem that LED lights cause. They're having a devastating impact on insects and other wildlife. Some studies say that LED lights are sort of responsible for the 50% of the insect apocalypse. So it's really far from just an aesthetic problem. Thankfully, slowly the tide is turning. In the US, a lot of cities are starting to introduce warmer lights. Pittsburgh became the first dark sky city in the US, passing an ordinance requiring maximum 3,000 Kelvin lights. And the same is true across the US. In the UK, there are some cities that have started pushing for warmer lights. Create Streets did a street design code for Surrey, where we require a maximum of 3,000 Kelvin. And in France, the entire country has banned lights over 3,000 Kelvin. So all the sort of cool lights are banned in France. So the tide is turning. And thankfully, technology is catching up as well. LED engineers used to say that, well, the bluer lights have traditionally been more energy intensive. That's no longer the case. The largest LED company in the world, Nishia, released a new product in 2019, which has the same efficiency at 2,700 kelvins as it does at 4,000 Kelvin. So you can't really not use warmer lights with that excuse that they use more energy. So what can we personally do? I think it's very fair to say that LED lights were introduced long before the technology was ready. And as I've shown, the tech has really caught up, so there's no longer an excuse for local authorities to be using the cooler lights now. Problem is that, as in the UK, for example, there's this massive kind of obsession with status quo, and county council highways authorities are really difficult to kind of change their minds once they pass an ordinance. But it's really important that we do, because it's not just an aesthetic concern. It's a really important environmental problem, and we have to hold local officials and politicians to account. And I really want to stress that anything less amounts to environmental vandalism and is downright negligent. That's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Is Stephen Florko ready? Stephen, with your presentation?
Yeah, ready to go.
Okay, please go ahead.
All right.
Stephen, can you please introduce yourself and who you are with?
Yeah, for sure. That's my first slide. So I'm Stephen Florko. I'm a traffic engineer. I'm working out of Winnipeg in Canada, kind of western part of the country. Maybe the most important thing about Winnipeg is that the children's character Winnie the Pooh, the bear, is named after Winnipeg. You can look into the history of that if you like. I work for a company called Moore Transportation Consulting. We are a small consulting firm that does work across the western part of Canada. I've listed my email address and I'm on LinkedIn. It'd be great to follow up with any of you. So I want to talk about how we can design the built environment for good urbanism, and also just realizing that we need to accommodate traffic to some degree. At least in North America, nearly every home has a vehicle. Most trips are made by vehicles. So how do we have this work without destroying the urbanism? So I want to focus just briefly on the speed of the vehicles is really an important component. And I want to talk about what the design of the street can do to influence that, and also what the design of the network can do to make good street design harder or easier. So the issue with speed is a few things. First of all, it's more difficult to cross a street that has faster moving vehicles. It's more dangerous. If a collision does occur, the consequences are worse, especially if you're outside of a vehicle. And it's also louder. So ideally, we're looking for traffic for the vehicles to be moving at no more than 40 kilometers per hour. 30 kilometers an hour is great. That's about 20 to 25 miles per hour. There are, of course, multiple ways that we can take care of speed. Governments will set speed limits. Sometimes they will do enforcement. Congestion sort of passively limits speed. And then there's a whole field of traffic calming where we manipulate the built environment. And these all, they have some effectiveness, but they also have some downsides as well. The best thing really that we can do to impact speed is just through the design of the street. And we've found that where streets have a lot of human activity, or even look like the kind of place that would have a lot of activity, people tend to be more attentive to the environment and sort of naturally choose lower speeds. So we can get into either a virtuous cycle or a vicious cycle, where when we have a street that's comfortable and interesting, it's good urbanism, people want to be there, they come there, the street's active, people naturally drive slower. Conversely, if a street is designed and it's uncomfortable, people don't come there. It's not a nice place. There's a lack of activity. And then as you're driving through, there's less things to be attentive to. You go faster and the cycle continues. You want to get into the virtuous cycle and stay away from the vicious cycle. So in my world, traffic engineer, three big things here are: we want the buildings fronting the street. We want active facades on the buildings with doors and windows and detail, texture. We want the street itself to be narrow in width, especially the width between the buildings. And we want frequent interruptions of the street. So lots of intersections, changes in alignment, that kind of thing. I'm speaking to you as a traffic engineer. I work within the right-of-way. I don't get to recommend what happened with buildings. So this is where I can't do this alone. And traffic engineers and architects need to work together to get these outcomes. Here's an example from Winnipeg. So on the left side of the screen, we have Sherbrooke Street, a little bit more of a traditional type street with the fronting buildings. You can see a few people in the frame. driving down this street, a speed that feels good is around 45 kilometers per hour, especially when you have parking activity along the curb and people crossing the street. That just feels comfortable. Going faster is uncomfortable. Unfortunately, in the mornings and afternoons, they restrict the parking along the street, so you get more space for the vehicles and it ends up being a little bit less hospitable, faster traffic. On the right, we have another street in Winnipeg that's a bit more suburban design. Traffic there moves along at more like 70 kilometers per hour. These streets have the same width between the curbs. If anything, there's actually portions of Sherbrooke Street on the left that are wider. They have very similar traffic volumes. But of course, the speed outcomes are different because of how the street looks and how it's used. Some research from the University of Central Florida.
Soon wrap it up. Sorry for that, if it's possible. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we'll go fast. Yeah. So really what it comes down to is when we're driving, we're processing all of these stimuli coming in. And when those stimuli come in too fast, we got to slow down to a rate at which we can process everything. Human bodies and human faces are some of the things that are like the most kind of visceral stimuli. So the presence of people in the street naturally makes us slow down. Limitations on this: when streets get too wide, you can have people out there, but they're too far away. They're kind of outside of your vision and you don't actually see them. Of course, this might sound like maybe we don't want to do wide boulevards. Not necessarily. We just need to break up the environment with trees and vertical features, make it look like it's a place for people. This is a bad road in Winnipeg. The network here, the way the road network works, there's only one route going north-south, and this is it. So there's a lot of pressure for it to be very wide, and then right away it's too wide to get that good design. We've got a picture on the right from Quitadella in Spain, in the Mediterranean. And so this is an example closer to what Leon Krier talks about, with having neighborhoods up to around 500 meters wide and boulevards on the edge. That gets you a nice density of boulevards, so they can all be still fairly narrow without a lot of pressure to carry too much traffic. So let's work together, engineers, architects, everyone else, and make great streets. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Michael Mahaffey is next, and he will present the title of our session, which is the 15-minute city and the history of ideas about the compact city. Please, Michael.
Thank you, Nikos. And I see some good friends there. Hey, Mike, and a number of other good friends. Let me make this quick. I'm going to talk about a rather controversial subject. Controversial not only because climate change itself is controversial, but it's some of the issues surrounding how we deal with climate change are controversial. Adaptation versus mitigation, for example. And I am going to put this in the context of the 15-minute city, because the reason that we have high emissions, as I'll talk about, the contribution to what's going on with the climate is in fact our high emissions from our urban form, as my own research has shown. This is Le Corbusier 1922, long before any of this was done. This is today, obviously around the world. And this is Adolf Bayer in 1948. This is the 15-minute city to the right. And this is not the 15-minute city. This is the 2-hour drive-through city, right? Where we're stuck in traffic and we're living a crazy high consumption lifestyle, et cetera. So we threw out the baby with the bathwater when we thought that this was disorder, disease, poor sanitation, et cetera. I think you're all aware of that. But this is a direct connection to urban sprawl and a direct connection to greenhouse gas emissions, as my own research has shown. A huge factor is urban form, is how we settle. This is, I won't run through this now, but this is the abstract for this session that some of you may have seen, talking about the importance of the characteristics of the public realm and the ways that we shape the public realm to be attractive and walkable and healthy and livable, low carbon, et cetera. I'm going to try to get to that. So one way to approach the climate change issue is just to say it isn't real or it isn't important, but I'm here to tell you 1856 Eunice Foote did the basic discovery. It's very simple. The mechanism is very simple, and it's we can measure it and track it. It's not really anything complicated. It is happening. But the other approach is to, you know, pants on fire, let's drop everything and deal only with this issue in a silo. I think that would be a huge mistake as well, because we have many other challenges, new and old. But even more important is the point that we should look at all of these challenges in a joined up way. We should look at climate and health and well-being and ecology and economic livelihood, all the other things as part of a joined up system. And addressing any one of them can address any of the others. And the thing that I think all of us on this conference are interested in is the quality of urban settlements, the quality of cities, towns, and suburbs, and the livability of those places. This is Stockholm, which I've had the privilege of being able to live part-time for the last few years. And I can tell you it's a very livable, beautiful place, wonderful environment, a little cold, but you know, the Swedes say there is no bad weather, only bad clothing. And this is San Antonio, where Nikos lives and where I just was and where I've also lived. And it is not so livable. You can be stuck in traffic for long periods of time. You can be very fragmented and disconnected from the things you want to get to, very much the opposite of the 15-minute city idea. And so let's compare these different urban forms. If you look, for example, at greenhouse gas emissions per capita, the relationship between an urban area like New York City and the US is about a threefold increase, quite dramatic. But also the increase from, say, the average Swedish settlement to the average US settlement is about threefold. Going from Stockholm to the average Swedish settlement, which includes a lot of suburbs and other more high emissions areas, is about a doubling. And if you look from, say, this Stockholm settlement to the average US settlement, like, say, San Antonio or Austin, that area, is about a six-fold increase. So what is going on here that accounts for such a magnitude? Is it that the US is 6 times richer? Clearly not. Stockholm per capita is richer. Is it US 6 times more livable and wonderful and everybody wants to live there? No, that's certainly not true. It's only 6 times more wasteful and 6 times more disorganized in the way that we've created our settlements to deliver good quality human experiences. We've delivered it very poorly, very inefficiently. So one of the factors that everybody focuses on, and they're right to do that, is density. And indeed, if you concentrate the buildings and you know, the activities and bring them closer together, that's more efficient. You're going to have lower emissions. And lo and behold, if you look at, say, the San Francisco area, the low emissions areas in the dark green are the more compact, denser areas. The higher density areas in the red are the higher emissions areas are in the red. And you can see, lo and behold, this map on the right is a density chart. The red is the high density and the blue is the low density. And you can see a very strong inverse correlation between those two. But much more important, I think, is we should not only look at density, we have to look also at all the other factors together. Again, the way these work as a system, the mix of daily amenities, the access to transit, the walkability, the efficiency of the infrastructure that you can easily get around, the street pattern and so on. These are all very important factors, and they're also very contribute to livability. I lived in this neighborhood also. In fact, that's my bedroom right above the end of the cable car there. And I can tell you firsthand that it is a very livable, beautiful, wonderful place to live. There's nothing wrong with it in terms of its livability characteristic. This is the East Bay. This is what we've been building for the last 50 years or so. Much more fragmented, car dependent, not walkable, not very hard to get around. So everybody holds up in their homes and, you know, has a very high consumption lifestyle inside the home because there's not much of a public realm to speak of, et cetera. Then this is what we're building. This is, you know, again, San Antonio, not to pick on where Nikos lives. I live there too. And this is Delft. So what does that mean in terms of the consequences where we can ride our bike. I wouldn't ride my bike in the environment on the left. That would be very dangerous. Versus, on the right, I can ride my bike, I can walk, I can stop off at a fresh food place, etc. It creates a whole system of lower carbon, higher health, higher quality, really, environments for people. So how do we get from one to the other? Well, I think we need to recognize, first of all, the characteristics of urban greening. We've talked a lot about the difference between adaptation and mitigation, but really urban greening is both, right? So is the reduction of pavement areas. So is the use of cool surfaces that make the environment more comfortable, but also radiate the sun's rays out into space, and so on. So we need to stop thinking about, all one or all the other, and we need to start thinking in a more joined up way. And we need to recognize the importance of biophilia, not only in greening the environment, but in creating biophilic patterns in our buildings. Acanthus leaves on classical buildings, there's an example of that. And again, creating all these things that work together as mitigation and adaptation that are also very powerful and desirable, popular and desirable in their own right, making a beautiful green environment that people are going to want to walk. If they're going to use transit, they've got to walk to get there. And having activities and life and diversity of people and food quality. And this is in Oslo, by the way, another wonderful example. And beauty matters. I'm going to wrap it up pretty quickly here, but I just want to touch on this. If we want livable, low carbon settlements, people are going to want themselves to get out and be in the public realm, walk, cycle, enjoy the outdoors. And I think we are able to do that. This is a project I was involved in for a number of years, doing a lot of the detailing and the building designs for the pavilions and other things. And I think it has been very successful. The research has shown at Orinco Station in the Portland area. And people do get out and walk more, quite a bit more. There's more social capital. The research is very encouraging about the results of this and the lower emissions lifestyle and so on. So we need a shared and common understanding of what we're doing when we build these places, why beauty is important, how to get it. And this is the clear research evidence that emerging from many fields, including mathematics. And Nikos, I'll just close on this because this is some work that Nikos and I have been doing on the concept of symmetry, which is closely related to the concept of beauty. And maybe I can put this in the chat, or you can Google it if you want to. Very important issue, I think. And again, symmetry gets dumbed down into this idea that it's just right and left. But symmetry is rotational, it's scaling, it's translational, repetitive forms, interlocking forms, and so on. And it's compound symmetries that are combinations of all of those things, and tiling symmetries in, many beautiful patterns in nature and in human art. And what I call deep symmetries, the symmetries between ourselves and what we experience in our environments, the experience of other people, the experience of landscapes, the experience of buildings in landscapes as they're positioning, and understanding the way symmetry forms naturally through biological processes, through morphogenesis. This is something that Christopher Alexander spent a lot of time on, understanding how forms come into being and have certain symmetrical properties, local symmetries, alternating repetition, levels of scale, scaling symmetries, and so on. And these things all are in abundance in traditional architectures because they are things that make us feel good, and they are things that evolve naturally in the most spontaneous architectures of human history, which goes way back. I won't spend a lot of time about it, but Vitruvius was very sophisticated about symmetry. So was Alberti, talking about consinitas. A lot of great work there. I'm going to skip all that because I know you guys need to get to the other topics. So I'll just jump ahead here. Actually, I'll close on this next to last slide, the idea of symmetry and sustainability. You all know the Pantheon, which has been in continuous use for 1900 years. And in comparison to some of our flashy new green buildings. I'm not so sure they're going to last 1900 years, maybe not even 40 years if we're 40 or 50 years. They're working on that. And I wanted to get to this slide very quickly and end on this. There we go. So Nikos and I have been working on this idea that we call symmetry deficit disorder. There is measurable evidence that if we don't have symmetry in our environments of this deep kind that I'm talking about, it has a measurable negative impact on our health and well-being. And I think we all understand that intuitively, but lo and behold, the research is showing that, and it's a very important finding, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Allow me to plug our book here, which is 9 years old. And this book came out before the 15-Minute City hit the newspapers. So I highly recommend our joint book.
Thank you, Nikos.
Hunt for a Living Planet. Okay, we are squeezed for time. Joseph Jutras is next. Joseph, are you ready?
I am, yes. Thank you, Nico.
Please go ahead.
So I want to talk about high-rise housing simply because I think many Western cities are experiencing something of a housing shortage. So I thought it was appropriate. And one of the reasons it keeps getting brought up as a solution is, of course, its density. So I wanted to look at that quickly and then get into what different studies show about the well-being. So I thought I'd look at the densest large city in America, which is New York City, versus the densest large city in Europe, which is Paris. And if we look at the two, we can see that New York City has about 11,000 people per square kilometer. Paris has about 20,000. It's not really fair, though. So if we remove Staten Island, then the density is 13,000 versus about 20,000. And if we really want to look at high rises, though, I think we have to go to Manhattan. So when we look at Manhattan, the density jumps up to about 29,000 per square kilometer. But Paris also includes the two lungs, so the Bois de Boulogne and the Bois de Vincennes. And if we can see kind of that the Bois de Boulogne is about, well, roughly twice the size or more of Central Park. So if we remove the two woods, and if we remove Central Park and the Island Park here on Manhattan, we see that the density is actually quite close. So now it's well, almost 32,000 people per kilometer squared versus 25,000 people per kilometer squared in Paris. So New York, or I should say Manhattan, is about 25% denser than Paris. So it's still quite comparable. It's not too bad. But Paris also has a river going through it. Manhattan doesn't. And there's a number of cemeteries in Paris. Manhattan, I don't believe, has any cemeteries, or at least not large ones. So if we take a neighborhood without a river or a cemetery or another large park, so for example, the 11th arrondissement, we see that the density jumps up now to, well, just over 39,000. So this neighborhood here is actually more dense than Manhattan in Paris. If we want to take a look to see what it actually looks like, here's just some Google Maps pictures. We see the 11th arrondissement here on the right. There's a number of tree-lined boulevards. There's some leafy squares. And this is East Side Manhattan. Here's Central Park up on the top left. And it's hard to believe, but these scales are almost the same. If you look at the trees, you can see they're roughly the same size. Yeah, it's very interesting. When you just look at these two, you would think the one on the left is much denser, but it's not at all. So the conclusion is that mid-rise apartments can be just as dense really as high rises, or at least very similarly in terms of density. But let's see how we respond to high rises. So I took a look at a paper written in 2007 called The Consequences of Living in High-Rise Buildings. It was written by Robert Gifford from the University of Victoria in Canada. And the paper's fantastic. And if you want a copy, just let me know. I'm happy to forward it to you. And it's a compilation of a number of different papers. So he looked at dozens of papers that were written over the past few decades. And I'll go over this really quickly. In general, satisfaction is higher in lower buildings. This one is especially interesting. There's a negative correlation between building height and resident satisfaction. Well, okay, there's the slide with the bird's eye view of both Paris on the right and East Side Manhattan on the left. Okay, can you see the satisfaction screen now?
Yes.
All right. Okay, I'll move quickly on because I know we're tight for time. So when we look at the satisfaction per demographic, there are some demographics that do find living in high-rises satisfactory, and those are essentially young mobile couples or childless couples or young singles. So they do like living in high-rises, basically because they have an urban environment, of course, at their fingertips. Elderly are fairly neutral. There's mixed results for studies for elderly and for parents with children. It wasn't just that they found high-rises less satisfactory, they've actually found them dissatisfactory. Strain is also generally higher in high-rises, so things like mental illness or feeling more crowded. Suicides, there are kind of two different types of suicides. One are planned suicides and the other more impulsive suicides. So if someone's feeling suicidal and then an opportunity presents itself, they will take it. Two different studies found that high-rises actually attributed to higher suicide rates amongst impulsive suicides. And in terms of pro-social behavior as well, normally there's a negative correlation with the higher the building, the less pro-social behavior there was. In crime and fear of crime, same thing. There are some studies, of course, that show that there is no correlation between fear of crime and high-rises, but most generally show a correlation between high-rises and crime and fear of crime. And same with relationships. Most studies show poor relationships with high-rises than low-rises. However, there's also some studies that show the opposite. So, for example, this study here from 1979 found that roommates on higher floors got along better with those on lower floors, but the rest of the studies all seem to conclude that higher floors have worse relationships. And when it comes to children, I'd say this is where the largest consensus is. Just looking at this picture, you see this child leaning over the railing and you want to kind of jump through the frame and stop him from falling over. But generally, there's a broad consensus that high-rises are not appropriate for children. There are negative terms for their behavior and their development as well. So in conclusions, mid-rise apartments can be just as dense as high-rise housing. And then in general, people are less satisfied. There's more fear, children development worse, and there's crime and more fear of crime within high-rises than in mid and low-rise housing. And that's it.
Okay, thank you, Joseph. Damu Radeshwar, are you ready, Damu, for your presentation? Where is Damu?
I think she's still doing some tech checks. So if you guys want to just engage in some conversation beforehand, and then she'll be ready on in.
Wonderful. Okay, so let's engage in some conversation. I put in the chat one of the new design patterns developed by Michael Mahaffey and his team, which includes myself, summarizing the case against high-rises and showing some giving references to calculations that show that one can achieve a very high density with human scale buildings that really reveals the so-called necessity for super tall buildings to be just a lie that is used by the real estate speculators. So I put that on the chat, and just to point to everyone that this is part of the wiki, which is uploaded by Robert Krasser, who is here with us today. So it's all free. So the book, A New Pattern Language, which contains this pattern, is up free. Thank you, Robert Krasser, for doing that. Would somebody like to join in the conversation while we wait for the next speaker? So let me
think there was
continue.
quite an interesting discussion in the chat a little earlier about the light topic. Does anybody involved also maybe go back on that and share a couple of ideas? I just thought it was quite interesting. The mic is yours, everybody.
Nobody. Here is Damu. Are we ready for Damu?
Then we move on to Damu, yeah.
Are we ready?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, please present Damu.
I think someone is going to run the slides for me.
I think it's Emily. Emily, are you going to run the slides?
I'll be running the slides.
Yeah.
So please start.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Damu Radeshwar. I'm an architect and urban planner. I will be speaking about renovation and restoration of Yale University Art Gallery in New Haven, Connecticut. Yale University, the gallery is one of the oldest museum in the Western Hemisphere, at the University Museum in the Western Hemisphere. In 2012, Polshek Iniad Architects, we restored and renovated the entire gallery. The structure, the presentation will speak to the initial work by Louis Kahn on the Kahn Gallery that we designed in 1953. Throughout the history, architecture has continued to evolve and develop by people in response to human needs and surroundings. The historical knowledge from the early times continues to spark creativity. Public institutions adopted historic imposing styles of architecture. The campus at Yale University, like most campuses, also followed this precept. Yale University tells the visitors, be sure to pay attention to the buildings around you and also the decisions made by the architects who designed them. Keep asking how lines, forms, and materials affect the way you move. Towards the group of architecture, the sequence of the art buildings was from 1866 to 1953. The composition included the first building on the Street Hall, which was designed and built in 1866, is shown in the image on the lower right. This is designed in the neo-Gothic style that defined the Yale's campus by the early 20th century. The building recalls the look of the 13th century Venetian palaces, characterized by its angular outline and polychromatic stonework. Next to the picture, next to that is a bridge that connects the Street Hall building to the next one to the left of it. It's an enclosed bridge connection, also designed in 1953, connecting the Swart Out building to the in a Tuscan Romanesque style. The middle one in the ensemble, as I've shown here, is a Swart Out building built in the 1928, designed in a Tuscan Romanesque, and that's the same one style that the bridge I spoke about previously. The third one, the last one in this ensemble, was built in 1953, designed by Louis Kahn. It was the first modernist building. Between the two wars and after the World War II, architecture experienced distinct influence and the changes that Europe was already undergoing. The phase of austerity required simplification. While Street Hall and the Swart Out, the two buildings I spoke about, they were built as function fits a form. The Louis Kahn building was following a modern adage, which was a form follows function. Louis Kahn designed building is a gallery building, and typical museum and gallery buildings, they have the control, they have a light and quality of air and temperature control. Louis Kahn himself was trained in a Beaux-Arts art tradition, which believed in creating resilient and adaptable buildings over the time. This was Yale's first modern structure, as I mentioned before. The gallery addition to the existing composition departed from the design vocabulary of the two precedent buildings in the sequence, starting with a distinct wide reveal, which you can see in the detail of the facade. The modern buildings that Louis Kahn designed, and also that other people have been following in the footsteps of Louis Kahn, did not just hit the new building to the existing building. So the wide reveal in the facade created a separation which respected the grandeur of the Swart Out facade. Louis Kahn's legacy is a testament of his sensitivity towards the design, which was followed by generations that came after him. So the gallery renovation and expansion celebrates the preserving of the stylistic distinction, as I've been mentioning, of the three historic buildings. So the priorities are here. Design prioritizes sequence and the smooth progression through the galleries, the existing glass window wall to the west and the north of the facade that you see in this particular image also. It helped create the optimum museum quality environment of the arts, safekeeping, and the extension of the life of the existing 70-year-old building. So just to explain it a little bit, the curtain wall, the glass and steel curtain wall that was part of this, the Louis Kahn ensemble was over the 70 years of the building, it started to deteriorate because of the quality of the material and the construction practices at the time in 1953 when it was built, started to really deteriorate. So the work that my office did was that open it up and see, that's where the forensic comes in the picture, open it up and see what had happened there and how to recreate it in aluminum and glass while still maintaining the quality of and the aesthetic of the architecture that was intended by Louis Kahn. What we also, as I was starting to see, what was the historic relationship of Kahn building to what he had studied as part of the Beaux-Arts architecture when he was in Rome. Marvin Trachtenberg, he writes that he intuited the Kahn connection just before he saw it again. The gigantic precinct wall of the Forum of Augustus, famous among connoisseurs of the Roman antiquity. Kahn had befriended the eminent archaeologist Frank Brown at Roman Academy. Marvin says the resemblance of his form, scale, and detailing of the enigmatic Chapel Street wall was difficult to deny, that it's so closely copied from what Trachtenberg has taken the picture of the Forum of Augustus wall. So the proportions and the textures and the thicknesses of the banding, Kahn had brought that historical understanding into the modern building that he was doing, however, still trying to maintain the reverence to the sought-out building by creating the wide reveal. So as I had mentioned before, Kahn's steel and glass window wall, regarded as a groundbreaking milestone at the time, over the years, it became subject to the structural and thermal problems originating from the material and technology. So the two facades that you see in the image right above the text and the facade that you see, which is the northern facade on the left of the text, that was something that we had to then, as I mentioned before, open it up, look at it carefully, follow the proportions, and then we had to do in a thermally broken aluminum and insulated glass wall construction. That was the exterior that we had to do. So the life of the building, which was 70 years already at that time, would expand, would live for another 100 years, another 50 years, or 100 years. I wanted to also quickly show that not just the exterior, but we also worked on the renovation and the restoration of the interior. Kahn's design had been celebrated for its beauty, geometry, light, and structural and engineering innovation, particularly the Platonic solid tetrahedral shape of the ceiling grid conceptualized by Anne Teng, who worked with Kahn. It envelops the inhabitant, creating a feeling of living in a geometric space. The renovation provides the unobstructed, light-filled vista that Kahn had envisioned. Kahn believed that every building must have its own soul. And this is what we see in the interior, the images that I showed in the previous slide, and also in the staircase design. The three images that you see here, the large one, that's the one on the street level floor of the sought-out building. The sought-out had these large arched windows with the glass, not thermally broken or anything. That turns out to be not something that you can actually show paintings and anything that organic or paper material. So this gallery was then devoted mostly to the elements that were more about stone, masonry materials. The two on the left of this here, these were the spaces that were recreated in the rest of the building, so they could be available for changing exhibits of any kind that were desired. I'll just quickly go through these few slides here. This shows here the seamless circulation connecting the new to the old. which is something that Khan had designed, and we kind of reinforced that by creating vertical circulation, but I will not go into detail of that. There are the floor plans of the three contiguous buildings here. The ground floor and the upper floor, the next level shows that how the three buildings were totally seamlessly making the continuous exhibit spaces. This is sorry, the last one, please. This shows the areas that we expanded as part of the project. We created a new gallery, which is shown on the lower left side of the lower image. This is the insertion in the existing volume. And right above that, we created a new gallery, which was on the roof of the SWAT out building. This shows the model, how we inserted within the footprint of the existing and created the new roof gallery. So this is my personal musing. We saw the treatment that Khan had done for the blank facade of the building that he had designed. I just thought that since Khan was in Europe studying architecture, if he had looked at what Tony Garnier did in Lyon Urban Museum, creating blank facades with art, morphological and historical stories that he created there. So I just leave this here. Louis Kahn, Beaux-Arts trained architect. Would he have been influenced by what he saw? So now we'll just go to the next slide, which is a summary of everything that I've shown. So my first question would be like somebody thinking about the design breaks the formality of the modernist free architecture. The next one is more about, would Khan have considered doing some kind of a large scale murals, bringing the art into the street? The third item is here about doing a building that every building must have a soul, taking that seriously, special, interesting features of the building, and also Khan had to work with the existing historic buildings and how he weaved into that, at least through interiors of the building, weaved into that of functional spaces, while the exterior was a modern, based on again the restrictions and the time, etc. Last, just wanted to say that my office, where I'm not working there anymore, but my office made sure that we worked with a building that would be now sustainable to the long term. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we need to move on to the next session. Professor Salingaros, do you have any closing remarks?
Yes. I want to go back to the talk of Michael Mahaffey, who had to leave, to remind everyone that Michael Mahaffey presented an urban model of how to create a more livable city, from which Carlos Moreno took some of his ideas for the 50-minute city. But all of Michael's talk was concerned with beauty, symmetry, small scale, ornamentation, path. So this has been mentioned throughout the TAG conference, namely the interdependence of the small scale to the intermediate scale to the urban scale. And that is something that underlines our work and that of Christopher Alexander, and is not consistent with ideas of some of the new urbanists who say, if you have a beautiful urban layout, then the architecture doesn't matter. Well, Michael Mahaffey and I say, yes, it does matter, because all the scales combine together. I just wanted to point out this important point from Michael's talk. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Imo, do we have time to talk?
Yeah, sure. I mean, until this room closes, please use
Okay,
the
I would
time.
like to call on Robert Krasser, whom I see moving around. Robert, please tell us more about the online pattern language that you're hosting.
Thank you for the question. We have the original pattern language from Christopher Alexander online, but just in German. And the new pattern language from Michael Mahaffey, it's online under also on the same page, under pattern language.wiki. And there's also the opportunity to add patterns you write yourself. And we judge them, and then we're gonna put them online as well. So it's a wiki where you can add your own patterns. And we mainly do it for students because some of them, they can't afford the expensive books. So we are allowed to do this in German, and the Michael Mahaffey's patterns are Creative Commons anyway. I will have a talk in 1 hour. I will explain it a little bit more in detail.
Okay, let me continue. I see a comment by Robert Wallach, who agrees with me on the interdependence of different scales in the city, which Michael and myself and Christopher Alexander and the patterns try to emphasize. And if we go back to previous talks, the session on eye tracking and complexity, it shows that the urban spaces are experienced as positive and human because of the surrounding facades and because of the detailed interest that can be observed and documented by the eye tracking. So this is a scientific proof using AI-trained software of the interdependence of all the scales. Robert, do you have a comment?
Yeah, absolutely, Professor. I think it's quite good to see that here in the UK. Maybe you had seen Thomas Heatherwick's book Humanize, where he raises this topic as well. He doesn't quite call it fractals, but he does make that same point that you can observe a building or a city at the street, or the door scale, as he calls it. And it's quite a popular kind of mainstream book. So I was really quite happy to see that those elements are kind of filtering into the kind of more mainstream design discourse. And I hope that it's something that will continue gaining prominence in design and architecture profession in the UK.
Well, I'm happy to report that Anne Sussman and Alexandros Lavdas from our conference attended the Humanize conference 3 weeks ago, and they met with Heatherwick, and it's all go. It's brewing. Very, very exciting developments are coming.